Okay, so thank you everybody to come to the final session for the afternoon. This is the Australian Migration History Network stream, and today this panel is a Flinders affair, but both the presenters and the chair are all from Flinders, so bringing the Flinders massive. So firstly, we're having Yianni Cartledge, who is has co-authored this paper with Andrekos Varnava. So Yianni is Andrekos Varnava's PhD student, and he's in his final year. And today he's talking about something different from his PhD research. Today he's going to be talking about the secret census of Greeks in Australia during the First World War. So Yianni, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Evan. Just checking the slideshow's up and working.
Yes, that's all good.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. I apologize. I did lose my voice last week, so I'm just sort of recovering it. This talk is called Making and Monitoring a Suspect Community, Australian Attacks on Greeks and the Secret Census in 1916, and it's co-authored with Professor Andrekos Varnava. This is sort of derived from a small part of my thesis, a kind of case study I looked at, and we've decided to take it and develop the idea a lot deeper. So on the 15th of June, 1916, W.H. Raymond, Commissioner of Police for SA, ordered all his inspectors and sub-inspectors to obtain confidential information as to the number, residence and occupation of Greeks resident in the state of South Australia, as nearly as can be ascertained, and that any rendezvous, such as cafes, clubs, etc., frequented by Greeks, should be kept under observation, and the names of proprietors, managers, and nature of such establishments furnished. So within 2 weeks, the SA Police had submitted a list with 178 names and 18 establishments. Such orders were received in every state in Australia in June 1916 from the Inspector General's Office of the Commonwealth Government on behalf of the Special Intelligence Bureau. So the so-called Secret Census, as one author has termed it, counted the number of Greeks resident in each state and the number of businesses run by Greeks. This was ordered because the Australian authorities questioned the loyalty of the Greek-Australian community to the war effort. The Greek government at the time was officially neutral, but considered sympathetic to the Central Powers, specifically to Germany, because the King of Greece, Constantine I, was married to the Kaiser's sister. So the primary focus of this article is to explore the Greek secret census as part of the story of Australian migrant communities and wartime loyalties. Is an early example of the Australian authorities monitoring migrant groups considered suspect during times of World War. Although the Commonwealth government may have been motivated by wartime concerns, attacks on the Greeks, including physical violence by the wider Australian communities, had clear racial and xenophobic characteristics. And for some Australians, disloyalty from migrant communities certainly impassioned their discontent and raised tensions, but so too did the notion that foreigners had taken their jobs or had established viable businesses that they perceived threatened them. So as a result of this research, we've also contesting the number of Greeks in Australia at the time, as the Secret Census also portrays a different number to those count in the previous and following censuses. So in recent years, there has been much research published on Greek-Australian communities before the mass migration of Greeks in the post-World War II period. So this paper looks at this research primarily through its exploration of the secret census, but also more broadly challenging the accuracy of the censuses and discussing Greek naturalization applications. Really, only a handful of historians have actually discussed the Greek secret census, primarily approaching it from the subject of Greek-Australian history and not broader Australian migrant surveillance. So essentially, Gilchrist was the first to discover the secret census in the National Archives during the 1980s, and he published mention of it in his volume in 1997 titled Australians and Greeks, where he broadly analysed it, mainly looking at the occupations of Greek migrants and the background of the Great War as well at the time. Gilchrist also typed out and annotated the Greek Secret Census, which is being kept in a collection in the NLA. He asserted that this was one of the very few secret censuses taken in Australia during the war, and while no official use appears to have been made of the information, of the more than 2,000 persons listed, only 7 were deemed to harbour disloyal sentiments. Several others have mentioned that the secret census occurred, but haven't really developed the idea in depth. Alexakis and Yanishevsky placed it in the context of wider anti-Greek demonstrations in Australia, such as at the Kalgoorlie Goldfields and at Boulder, WA. They also contested the number of Greeks typically held at the time, comparing it to the book Izoin in Australia, which listed 50 Greeks in Brisbane, compared to the secret census, which listed around 200 Greeks in Brisbane. Piparoglu looked a little deeper at the secret census in his PhD dissertation to help contextualize Greek migrants in Australia during the Great War. And he interestingly suggested that despite the fact that the census was conducted confidentially, the extensive quality of the listing suggests that a number of Greeks may have acted as informants for various police officers. On WA, further, Appleyard and Yiannakis noted that the secret census was based on information obtained by police officers without the knowledge of the subjects, and they analysed it in the context of Greek demographics and how they were portrayed as a threat. Demusi expanded further on broader wartime context to explore the violence against Greeks by the wider Australian communities from late 1915 and into 1916, mainly focusing upon the attacks in Newcastle and Kalgoorlie as well. So this paper asserts that in order to understand the secret census, it's also important to understand the wider attacks on Greeks, even if the government motivation for the secret census was connected primarily to wartime loyalties, and that the attacks were more racially motivated in this sense. So really referring to it as a secret census obscures the fact that it was part of the police surveillance of the state on suspect communities. And this paper also aims to apply and historicize the term suspect communities, which was first used by Paddy Hilliard to describe the heavy policing of the Irish in Britain during the 1970s and 80s. And it's been since used by several other historians, all listed here. Notably, there were other censuses actually taken at the time during World War I, sorry. Ultimately, these censuses, though, differed really in content than the secret census of Greeks. So one comparable group were the Turks in Australia, who were noted in a secret list in 1918. Although the Ottoman Empire had joined the Central Powers in November 1914, this list did take 4 years before it was produced. Many of those listed in the Turkish list were actually Greek-speaking Christian Ottomans, including some who were counted also in the secret census. Other migrant groups that were monitored during World War I weren't really to the extent of the breadth and depth of the secret census of Greeks. And mainly these other lists that are all listed here ultimately just listed military men of military age, rather than the Greek secret census that aimed to gather all Greeks in Australia. So in exploring the policies of the Australian government targeting the Greek community and branding it as suspect, namely categorizing them as enemy aliens for the purpose of naturalization in November 1915, and only considering applications from those aged 16 and above, and then conducting the secret census as a prelude to internment if Greece joined the Central Powers, it was discovered that the Greek numbers in the 1911 census were lower than the real numbers of Greeks in Australia. This fact was discerned based on the number of applications for naturalization in 1916, which was around 3,000. And the number of persons and businesses listed in the secret census, which first occurred in New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria, SA, WA, and Tasmania, and was followed late in 1916 in the NT as well. So estimating the true number of Greeks in Australia is paramount when interrogating the secret census and when understanding why the secret census and violence against Greeks took place. So the 1911 secret census, the 1911 census rather, included a range of terminologies which together can help unravel the nature of Greeks living in Australia. These terminologies such as birthplace, ethnicity, nationality, and religion add to the complexity of the census and often mask the real identities of those being counted. Greeks are really described in this period as Greek-speaking, people of Greek-speaking background and usually Eastern Orthodox, encompassed a range of different national, cultural, religious, and socioeconomic identities in Australia. The most notable were Greeks from the Kingdom of Greece that also had Greek nationality, as well as Greek speakers from the Ottoman, British, and Italian empires, especially via Cyprus, Egypt, and the Dodecanese, and also those from autonomous or shortly independent islands, including Crete, Icaria, and Samos. Other Greek islands, such as the Ionian Islands, had been part of the British Empire for much of the previous century, and these identities are not really captured properly in the census, as there is often confusion. Greek islanders and Ottoman subjects, who made up the majority of Greeks in Australia during this period, ultimately traversed the extremity of these identities and bounced between multiple administrations during the 1910s. So the 1911 census ultimately listed 6 discernible birthplaces associated with Greeks, being Greece, Turkey, Egypt, Cyprus, Crete, and Samos. The inclusion of Samos, which was an autonomous principality, implied that it was considered Asiatic during its proximity to Turkey. Turkey, or at this point in time really was the Ottoman Empire, was counted as a European country, likely due to the nature of the Ottomans in Australia being mostly Christians as opposed to Muslims. So in total, the census noted as many as 2,325 people born with a Greek-speaking background. Additionally, the 1911 census also categorized by religion. As you can see here, this was more nuanced than birthplaces, and it paints a different picture of Greeks in Australia. The main categories were noted here, with the Greek Catholic category encompassing all other categories, as well as the Russian Church and others. So the term Greek Catholic itself is loaded with complexities. However, most scholars acknowledge that it was a misnomer that denoted Eastern Orthodoxy more broadly, as well as Eastern denominations not in communion with Rome. It does not denote the Ukraine's Russians, known as the Ruthenians or Greek Catholics, or Greece's Catholic minority, as they did not have notable presences in Australia in this period. This is also supported by the birthplaces of Greek Catholics, which you can see here, with Greece being the largest portion at 1,365, followed by Australasia at 394. The total number of Greek Catholics was 2,580, which did not including the Russian Church and others, and was actually higher than those listed under birthplaces, which likely accounts for Australian-born children of Greek migrants, as well as Orthodox people from other nations. The Greeks, sorry, 1 second, guys. The Secret Census gives really a different number of Greeks in Australia. According to Gilchrist, it listed 2,398 Greeks in Australia, which excluded the NT at the time, which took its own register of Greeks and Maltese in 1916. The Secret Census is also difficult to get an accurate figure for. In his papers, Gilchrist gave different numbers, as do the NAA files, especially for Victoria, which does not correlate to the count the authors conducted, which was Andrekos and myself, of 261. So, however, this count fits with Gilchrist's total figure, really. So what is overlooked is that the Secret Census did not always count women and children, or Australian-born Greeks, or, as we discovered, landowning Greeks as well. Some known non-Orthodox Greeks also appeared to be absent from the list. And additionally, in 1916, large numbers of Greeks were requesting to be naturalized, with around 3,000 on record. However, when compared to the numbers applying for naturalization in 1916 to the Secret Census, it is clear that not all Greeks were counted. or catalogued. It is estimated that between 1911 and 1916, there was likely to be as many as 3,000 to 4,000 Greeks in Australia, with a high estimate from 4,000 to 5,000. So this means that there was a near doubling between the previous census and 1916. This number is in addition to the already naturalized Greeks as well, and the Australians born of Greek heritage. So some of this increase is due to turmoil in the Aegean, especially the Balkan Wars, 1912 and 13, which pushed many Ottoman and Islander Greeks to emigrate. However, it also points to the lack of proper recording in the 1911 census, as well as the prevalence of ship jumping in the era. Another factor could stem from the transient nature of Greek labourers in Australia. So the NT, which was left out of the secret census, eventually took its own list of both Greeks and Maltese, beginning in November 1916. This list was only of men of service age who were asked to visit the Military Register's office on 17th of November 1916. So it is unclear where the record for this register actually is held. However, the NAA gives the impression that at least 264 Greeks were registered as aliens in the NT in this period. Gilchrist places his own estimates at somewhere similar between 120 and 350.
Yianni, you got 5 minutes left.
No problem. So really, the large number of Greeks in Australia was corroborated by the Greek community in 1919. It was claimed that there were over 2,000 Greeks from Castello Resort alone in Australia by a man named Jack Koutsoukis in reply to an article. An article by James Williams questioned the nature of Castelloresians' ethnicity and denoted them as Asiatics, echoing the xenophobic tone of the decade. So Williams stated that the Castelloresians loaf under verandas and in cook shops. God help us if these men are considered specimens of good settlers and citizens. We cannot forget how our troops were murdered by the Greeks when the Allies went to their assistance. So these comments stemmed from the loaded questions of loyalty, race, and labour that sparked the secret census 2.5 years earlier. So leading up to the secret census, targeted violence against Greeks was present in Australia. Between 1915 and 16, there were multiple instances of anti-Greek riots and demonstrations around the country. In New South Wales, there was an attack on Greeks noted in newspapers at Sydney, Glen Innes, Haymarket, Manly, Newcastle, and Liverpool in November and December 1915. And in Sydney and Haymarket, Greek businesses and nearby shops were targeted by Australian soldiers. Michael Casamati's Oyster Saloon near the Town Hall, Miss McEwen's millinery shop and Serber Bros shop were attacked by the rioters who smashed windows with large lumps of concrete and blue metal. So the police drew their batons and there were both rioters and police injured. 8 soldiers and additional civilians were arrested. Similarly, at Manly, a Greek restaurant and Italian or Greek fruit shop were targeted, and 23 soldiers and 2 civilians were charged with having disturbed the peace. Apparently, they had been calling out, "We want those Greeks," and it completely wrecked the building. Stones were thrown, a revolver shot, and Greeks had been attacked with water and gas pipes. Just skipping forward a little bit. These soldier-led attacks were generally sparked by questions of Greek loyalty to Australia, but they also stemmed from the idea of foreign labour, which dominated discussions at the time. So one article from January 1916 titled "Greeks, Maltese and Egyptians, Their Value as Workers" echoed this discussion. So articles like this made brazenly racialized comments about Mediterranean work ethics, portraying the Greeks as powerful, lazy fellows, 4 of them about equals 1 average Australian trench toilet. So protests began against foreign workers had been frequent during the 1910s, with anti-immigration demonstrations organised by the British Immigration League in 1911-1914 in Port Adelaide, and an amalgamated miners' association union protest of foreign miners working for BHP in 1913. Later, in 1917, Port Pirie also had further targeted attacks on Greek businesses, with rocks being thrown at them, gunshots, and race-motivated chanting. And further in the Anglosphere, white labourism demonstrations were taking place in London and Johannesburg in 1914, and there were even anti-Greek riots in Nebraska, Toronto, and attacks following in the 1920s from the Ku Klux Klan in Utah against Greeks. So we'll go forward just a bit here. Ultimately, the Greek secret census was painted as a war precaution, but we believe that it was also spurred on by the race-motivated attacks during the period. Greece ultimately joined the Entente and did not join the Central Powers, which led for there to be no need for internment of Greeks. However, you can see that this is actually what information was taken of Greeks in Australia, which in a way presented a whole, I guess, a whole kind of blueprint for interning Greeks had it come to that point, with their location, nature of transport, distance from capital, places of meetings such as clubs, cafes, and other institutions being recorded. There's a lot more research to be done on the Greek secret census, and it is one of the earliest mass surveillances of particular ethnic groups in Australia, which makes it a very interesting line of research. And we'll leave it there, but yeah, thank you for listening, guys.
Thank you very much. Okay, so Yianni, we're doing questions straight away rather than doing two papers and questions. So I guess I'll open it for questions. So first off,
firstly, I'm not 100% sure why the focus there hasn't been, I guess, a lot of in-depth research on this period. I know that one historian, Karen Agata, has looked a lot at the Italians during World War I, even exploring, I think there were sort of deportations for sending Italians back to Italy to fight for Italy during the war. So there was that kind of surveillance of the Italians and then an actual act of deportation following that. I guess the Greek secret census hasn't received a lot of attention, as nothing really came out of it after the lists were taken. So Greece didn't join the Central Powers. There was no need for internment, so they weren't sort of acted upon. And really, they've sort of mainly been used more as a resource for kind of looking at Greeks in Australia rather than monitoring. So, and I guess an exploration of monitoring is a kind of a newer concept as well. But yeah, there may be other research on other groups during the World War I period that I haven't sort of come across yet, but definitely will look a bit deeper. Second question was was it motivations?
yes.
The main motivation, I believe, was that, yeah, they were very concerned about the Greek king joining the Central Powers. During the war, the Greek king was deposed and replaced with Venizelos. So there was a coup during that time, in a sense. So that sort of crushed any need for enactment of the secret census. But I believe as well that the Greeks were a significant and large minority, listed as aliens and some later on as enemy aliens. So I guess there was a lot of paranoias that led to the decision to conduct the secret census around that. Yeah, and I guess it sort of comes in three streams. There's that questions of migrant loyalty, questions of xenophobic kind of attitudes, as well as that sort of white labourism movement that was present in Australia at the time. That sort of was a bit of a pressure to do something about these foreigners that may possibly, be, I guess, enemies within if they do join the Central Powers. So, yeah, hope that answers the question, I guess.
Thank you. Oh, another question.
Good questions. The means of communication section there. So it doesn't actually ask for any actual mean of communication. It is just asking for transport and distance from capitals. Generally, the mode of transport was always listed as rail. So, and then distance from capital would literally be the distance from their location to each state the closest state capital, I guess. So I see this as, I guess, if they had to transport Greeks, they would take that as for this town, for instance, for Port Pirie, which is a town I've looked closely at, they're all virtually rail and they're all virtually the same distance from Adelaide. So that would be the means of transporting Greeks to the capital and then from there into internment. Yeah, it is an interesting thing for them to note. Yeah, there's none really outside of, it's either sort of left blank if they already are in the capital, or if they're in a country, a rural kind of area, it's usually rail. I think one was by boat because there was no rail somewhere down the west coast of South Australia as well. I noticed that there wasn't actual a rail system there, so it was by boat was the transport method. So yeah, that was, I guess, their way of, I know, preparing for internment. The lists of secret census, I'll get it back up. I actually really found it interesting, the lists as well that they took, but yeah, there was no list I can find of Germans. That it may have been conducted, but I haven't been able to locate it at all. Virtually, besides the Greeks in 1916, all of these were just military-age men, which is really interesting. And some of them obviously are post-war, so there are other paranoias going into this as well. Germans, I guess, they had a huge population in Australia. South Australia had large German communities. So I would be interested to see what their plan was during, if there was any. But yeah, I just haven't been able to locate any, I guess, information on that. Someone might have seen something.
I know, Yianni. It's because they legislated in 1916 that all Germans had to report to the police. So there were military age people from 1914, so men, and then 1916, all Germans had to be registered with the police because of impossible internment. So they didn't need a secret census because they already had to make them. They already had the police powers to encourage them. Awesome. That's me.
Thanks, Evan.
That's
yeah,
Evan.
Thanks, Evan. Yeah, that explains it perfectly, I guess. Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah. Okay. We have time for another question if anyone has, has a burning desire, or else I'll abuse my chair privileges. Okay. Anyone? No. Okay. Yianni, my final question was, and now what was it? So with the Greeks who are, considered were from the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire is on the enemy side, but so were they, but Greeks are seen as the neutral, were they considered enemy aliens or not? Or did religion play into that? That if they were, Christian, they were considered one thing, but, the Ottoman Turks were considered, Muslims were considered another thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's something I didn't get to actually talk about because of time, but I'll put this slide up because it kind of relates. There was, Greeks from the Ottoman Empire were basically counted just as Greeks because and I think religion was the main base of that. In that, you did have some people that weren't actually Greeks, but they were Christians from the Ottoman Empire that got counted along with the Greeks, probably out of that confusion, especially Orthodox Lebanese and Syrians were counted. So there was a few examples I've got on the screen here of people that were counted, that none of them actually, these 6 men, none of them identified as Greek. And this was just from the SA census, so I'm sure this happened in other states when I get to look at them deeper. But yeah, I think religion was a huge categorizing factor here. And it seemed to be beyond actual origin and language because on the left here, you can see there were families that were of Greek origin that were landowning kind of more affluent families that actually weren't categorized because neither of them really were strongly Orthodox in a sense. One family was, the Norths were Roman Catholics, and one were kind of between Orthodox and Anglican, depending on the situation. So yeah, I think religion was a huge categorizing factor here, more than actual place of origin. But there was a secret list of Turks conducted, which looked to count, I guess, non-Greeks from the Ottoman Empire. It was just of males. Syrians, Armenians, Jews, and Greeks did end up getting counted along with that. And this list was almost a bit of a blunder as well, because actually, as you can see here, J.S. Hari noted that quite a number of Greeks in Australia who should have registered as Turkish subjects have not done so, but have registered as Greeks. So even the people that were registering were confused. What should we count ourselves as? So yeah, in a sense, I guess that Ottoman Empire kind of blurred lines between who was counted. So I guess religion became one of the biggest categorizing factors. So yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. So I'm going to hold the microphone to the crowd and everyone's going to clap and say thank you for your wonderful paper. Okay. All right. Thank you. I'm going to,
thanks everyone.
do some technology